try and draw together some of the threads and look at the lessons for leaders to learn. Now, Shaheen, you work with the leaders of some extraordinary organisations. Just help me understand how technology has changed the boards of those organisations.
That's a brilliant question, Ollie. I think it's actually been quite dramatic, especially in the last sort of 5 years. We're seeing an absolute blurring of the role of the CIO and the CEO. And to some extent, every CEO needs to be a CIO and vice versa. And we used to talk about the role, especially of the CIO in the C-suite, in the boardroom, as a kind of service role. You know, everybody else will work out what the business needs to do, the business strategy will be created, and then the CIO and his function or her function will service it. And we're seeing a flip of that. It's really interesting because the business and the technology strategy are inextricable. And actually, technology is going to be the determinant, and already is, of many business strategies and where business is going to go and the outcomes that they need to achieve. And that, I think, has been an incredibly important inflection. And that has cascaded all the way out of the boardroom into the organisation. Even in Accenture, we have a huge TQ, what we call Technology Quotient Programme, where every single person in the firm, whether they're in industry, whether they're in kind of consulting and strategy, whether they're in technology, is trained on cloud and AI and security and all of these things that we've been talking about today, because digital transformation demands that level of proficiency.
So one conundrum then is, how do the leaders remain as connected as possible to their organisations, to their colleagues, particularly if they're increasingly distanced from them? What are some of your sort of closing reflections on that? Because the upside is huge and the downside is, frankly, voices go completely unheard.
We talked about it earlier. We talked about this idea of whatever return to work looks like and walking the floor. I mean, it used to be a concept when we were kind of growing up in the city, that you would really see the leaders of the board intimately involved with people on the ground every single day asking questions. And there is this, and it's a really important one actually, there is this idea of listening again, and active listening again, and asking the relevant questions in order to get to the heart of what is really happening in your organisation. There cannot be dissonance, there can't be that set of kind of walls that have happened between us. You know, even the idea of the boardroom, right, a set of walls that disconnects to some extent the executive team from everything else, I think is really something that is going to be quite different in the next 5 years.
Well, there's an interesting contrast there, isn't there? Because we can remove walls, we can open things up, and yet in a world in which increasingly our meetings are being literally and deliberately recorded, presumably we still have to keep some room for candid conversations which remain between two individuals.
For sure. I mean, being on Zoom, being on Teams and any of these technologies, for all its goodness, still puts you in a place where you are online on performance, right? That you can't be filtered in the way that you may want to be when you're having a face-to-face conversation. That idea of the casual conversations and the corridor stuff we talked about earlier, I think is going to continue to be really important, because that's where psychological trust is built. That's where you are unedited. That's where the insight happens. And so that connection, I think, is going to be really, really key, Ollie, as we move forward. It's going to be, and it's not techniques, it's kind of going back to just normal human behaviours and things that we have always done that we should retain.
And also, ironically, following a global pandemic, or still in the midst of it, that feeling of safety. A feeling of emotional safety.
Absolutely. And disloyalty. You know, I don't think any C-suite at the moment is under any illusions that people have choices about where they work. This market, especially for technology talent, is incredibly hot. And so the idea of really investing in the employee experience is going to be key. It's paramount. You know, we can talk about our customers, we can talk about, you know, the civic impact and all of the things we've been talking about today. Everything starts at home, which is, how do your people feel? You know, there's that lovely quote, I think it's a Maya Angelou quote, about people will never forget, people will forget what you said, people forget what you did, but people will never forget the way you made them feel. And that is an interesting one, I think.
Well, also, it makes me think about the way people feel about organisations as well. So let's go to the leaders of tomorrow. How confident are you that our current education system is developing the skills, the attributes that we need, not for stronger, better businesses, but for a stronger, better society?
I don't think we teach leadership. I think we have made the assumption, certainly in the education system that I grew up in, that it is something that is either innate, and you just do it, and you just, you know, it just is, or you learn it on the jobs, and often you are a mosaic of the number of leaders that you've worked with.
Yeah.
So this integration of what I would call kind of modern leadership skills into the curriculum is something that we are already talking to education about. We're talking to universities about it, we're talking to schools about it. We're really talking about that level of empowerment very, very young in the way that children understand what leadership is.
So let me pause briefly, forgive me,
Yes.
Shaheen. On those modern leadership skills, someone will be saying, like what?
Like what? And I'm not going to talk about the technical side of it, because there's obviously competency and capability and all of those sorts of things. In this moment, Ollie, the idea of empathy, the idea of humility, right, this openness to really understanding all of those things that were talked about today, the ecosystems, the different perspectives, the working with very different characters that you never would have experienced before, is going to continue to be really key. So how do you really create curiosity in the way that children are learning? You know, I said it before, we don't teach children how to learn, right? And actually one of the greatest skills I think that modern leaders are going to have is the ability to learn, continuum. And it's really interesting that sense of critical thinking, that sense of exploration, that sense of play is going to be really, really important, because modern leadership demands a sense of imagination and courage. And that might sound a little bit soft and trite,
it doesn't.
but in a world where you have all of these technologies that we've talked about, in a world where you have industry able to do what it has already demonstrated it can do at the speed that it can do it, in a world where you have some of the most wicked problems that we are foreseeing, and this year was a big year. We had some significant social movements. We had, you know, all of the things that were the reckoning to some extent, climate change, Black Lives Matter, you know, things that are going to continue to be all pervasive in terms of our future. We need children that are going to be able to solve those problems, and those children need to be orchestrators of all of the things that we've talked about.
But I think technology is well placed to embrace this. If you think of its history with play, with fueling our imagination, the scene is set in that sense.
It absolutely is. If you look at the 60s as the decade of a real kind of technology revolution, and people will argue about this, it's kind of, when did it start? Software engineering was kind of, you know, the 1960s. And even if you look at and bear with me on this, even if you look at some of the, what I would call most symbolic moments of where technology came to life, it was that decade. And I'll take Sesame Street as an example, because we're talking about education, but I think Sesame Street is probably one of the most powerful illustrations of a multidisciplinary team that did product design and put the end user, the child, at the heart of the mission. Yeah. And they had Harvard professors, they had child psychologists, they had musicians, artists, puppeteers, they had technologists, they had engineers. You know, all of these people suddenly came together with a view that we were going to develop an outcome for these children that was going to be better than it was today.
Yeah, and not just debatably so, measurably so.
Measurably so.
They talk about the Sesame Street effect.
They do, and television was a digital technology. you know, it really was. And if you look at what happened to those kids and their levels of attainment, it's unfathomable really now to see that was happening just in 1967. It is so vivid and such a brilliant template and exemplar of great leadership.
It's great because it's tempting, isn't it, to say, well, the great cross-sector collaborations sit tomorrow, but actually the ability to learn, maybe not even from the 60s, maybe even from hundreds of years ago, might become even more important.
I'm convinced. You know, we talked about the history, you know, we've talked about the psychologists, we've talked about the people that really understand ethics, we've talked about writers, and, you know, Emma talked about poets and painters and programmers and everybody at the table together. If you can get leaders that understand how to orchestrate that amount of talent and power in a room, you're onto something we've never seen before.
Well, Shaheen, that is an incredibly powerful vision to look forward to. For now, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks, Ollie. It was really lovely to be here.